We're starting a new series this morning on the subject of marriage. And in this first sermon, I just want to lay a foundation. In other words, I want to give you some basic information that everyone needs to know in order to have a good marriage. And much of what I'm going to share with you this morning I've shared before, but it's worth repeating, and it lays the foundation for what I'm going to be teaching on over the next few weeks. So let me start by giving you a very simple principle. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. Healthy people make for a healthy relationship. Unhealthy people make for an unhealthy relationship. And of course, I'm talking about emotional health, not physical health. You can be in the best shape of your life and bench press 500 pounds and squat 750 pounds and run marathons, but that's not going to have any bearing on the relationships that you have. So we're not talking about physical health, we're talking about emotional health. So what I'm saying is this, if we want to put it in layman's terms. The more screwed up you are, the more screwed up your marriage will be. The less screwed up you are, the less screwed up your marriage will be. Now, I want you to notice that I use the words more and less, insinuating that everyone is screwed up to some degree. Some are just more screwed up than others. That's why everyone has problems in their marriage from time to time. It's because everyone is screwed up to some extent. Now, let me explain why I say that everyone is screwed up to some degree. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Matthew, chapter 6. We're going to read verses 22 and 23. Notice what it says. Your eye is a lamp that provides light for your body. When your eye is good, your whole body is filled with light. But when your eye is bad, your whole body is filled with darkness. And if the light you think you have is actually darkness, how great that darkness is. Now, this passage of Scripture is difficult to understand unless you realize that it's an analogy. It's an analogy between the way we physically see things and the way we mentally see things. Now, does everyone know what an analogy is? An analogy is an explanation of something by comparing it point by point with something else. And the key to understanding any analogy is knowing what each thing represents. So let me make this easy for you and just tell you what each thing represents. The eye represents a person's perspective. In other words, the way they see things. So when I talk about perspective, I'm talking about the way you see things. Not physically, but mentally. Light represents truth. Darkness represents falsehood. And believe it or not, the body represents the mind. So look back at the last part of verse 22 and verse 23, and let's see what Jesus was saying. And to make it easier for you, I'm going to replace each analogous word with the word it represents. And I'll put the analogous words in parentheses with a smaller font and in italics so you can see what we're replacing and why we're doing that. Here's what it says. When your perspective is good, your whole mind is filled with truth. But when your perspective is bad, your whole mind is filled with falsehood. And if the truth you think you have is actually false, how great is that falsehood? Now, we didn't put it in smaller font. I wish we would have done that because you were probably trying to come in and look at that. But anyways, what this is actually saying is you're blind to the truth. Yeah. This is deep, people. So I want to make sure that you caught what Jesus was saying. And Jesus was saying that if we have the wrong perspective on something, what we think is true is really false. Or in other words, what we think is right is really wrong. But in our mind, it's right and there's no doubt about it. So we don't even consider the possibility that we might be wrong, which makes us blind to the truth. And that's why our perspective on things is so important. Think about it. If you have the wrong perspective on something, that means that what you think is right is really wrong. In layman's terms, you are one screwed up puppy. And this explains why so many people are screwed up. Something bad happened to them in their childhood or maybe their teenage years, and it screwed up the way they see things. Or maybe they were raised in a dysfunctional family, and it screwed up the way they see things. So what they think is right is really wrong, but they don't realize it. In fact, they go through their entire life thinking that their perspective is normal, but it's not. It's screwed up. That's why I say when it comes to interpersonal relationships, I don't deal with truth. I deal with people's perception of truth. I've seen people who don't have two nickels to rub together. But the reason they're poor is because of the choices they've made and also because they don't know how to handle their finances properly. But when you talk to them, they'll tell you that it's not their fault. You see, in their mind, the problem is, I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. From their perspective, they just didn't have the opportunities that other people had. People, that's hogwash. They were born in America with free public education up to the 12th grade, and college is available for everyone. The truth is they just made poor decisions and squandered the opportunities they had. But you'll never convince them of that. Why? Because they are blind to the truth. In their mind, they're convinced that it's not their fault. So why should they even consider the possibility that it could be their fault and that they possess the power to do something about it? So they just keep on squandering their opportunities and mishandling their finances. But it's all because of their perception. So as I said, when it comes to interpersonal relationships, I don't deal with truth. I deal with people's perception of truth. I'll be honest with you, about 3 weeks ago, I came into the office and Shirley says, you need to listen to what's on our voicemail. So I listened to it and oh my gosh, this person is angry at me. And she wants me to call her back. And so Shirley gave me the number and she said, I wouldn't call them back if I were you. Well, I went and called them back because they asked me to call them back. And this lady said, I didn't think you'd have the balls to call me back. I said, well, I am a man. And she said, you don't remember me, but about 10 years ago, I came to your church. And she said, you told everyone not to pray for me, and you told me that I wasn't welcome in your church. I said, well, ma'am, I'm sorry if that's what you think, but let me just say this. I have never told anyone that they're not welcome in my church. I told her that we have people with mental illness that come to our church that a lot of churches won't allow. We have people that are big-time problems that come to our church that we've never told them they can't come to our church. And I would have never told people not to pray for you. Yes, you did. And she started telling us, I said, well, ma'am, I'm sorry you feel that way. And I'm sorry you think that. But I don't believe that's what really happened. I think you believe that. And then I got off the phone with her, of course, after she cussed me really good. And I got to thinking about it because I've never told anyone they can't come to my church. But I knew that she really believed that. And then I got to thinking, well, you know how I am in teaching. Maybe I said something that she perceived to be that way. But one thing that I've learned as a pastor is that when it comes to interpersonal relationships, I don't deal with truth. I deal with people's perception of truth. And because they believe that that's true, they don't entertain any type of thought that they could be wrong, and as a result of that, they're blind to what is really true. Now, let me explain how having the wrong perspective on something can really screw up your life. When a person has the wrong perspective, it causes what psychologists call cognitive distortion, which is just a fancy way of saying they don't think right. So that person ends up making bad decisions. But even worse, they develop a pattern of making bad decisions that's self-destructive. Now, that makes perfect sense if you think about it. Let me explain why. We make decisions based on what we think is right. But if we have the wrong perspective on something, that means that what we think is right is really wrong. So we're making decisions on what we think is right, but it's really wrong. So the decisions that we're making are bad decisions, and we don't even know it. In fact, we think we're making the right decision, so when it blows up in our face, we don't understand why. In our mind, we're doing the right thing, but we're getting the wrong results. And the only thing that we conclude is, I must be unlucky. No, you're not unlucky. You're reaping what you sow. You think you're making the right decision based on the truth, but you're actually making the wrong decision based on a falsehood. But it all comes down to one thing. We have the wrong perspective. What we think is right is really wrong. Are you getting this? Now, let me give an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. Let's suppose that you have the wrong perspective on how to raise kids. What that means is that what you think is the right way to raise kids is really the wrong way. So guess what's going to happen? You got it. You're going to raise your kids the wrong way. And when they grow up and have problems, you're going to say, I don't understand it. We raised our kids right. But the truth is you didn't. You just think you did because you have the wrong perspective on raising kids. So as a screwed up parent, you raised screwed up kids because they're going to grow up thinking that the way you raise them is normal, and they're going to pass that on. And that's why dysfunctional behavior is passed from generation to generation, because they're going to grow up thinking that they were raised the right way when really they weren't. And they're going to raise their kids that way, who in turn will raise their kids that way. But I really haven't explained how the wrong perspective on something can ruin your life. So let me try to do that. Everyone makes bad decisions from time to time. Everyone. But that doesn't mean that it's going to ruin your life, usually. What ruins a person's life is when they continue to make the same bad decisions over and over again. They actually develop a pattern of making bad decisions that's self-destructive. And why do people do that? Again, it all goes back to perception. Those people think that they're making good decisions based on what's right, but they have the wrong perspective. So what they think is right is really wrong, but they don't know that. So they keep making the same stupid decisions over and over again, and a pattern develops. So over the course of their life, they keep making the same mistakes again and again. Now, let me give you a biblical example to illustrate what I'm talking about. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of John, chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. If you're familiar with the Bible, you know that John chapter 4 is the story of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. And of course, Jesus is at this well in the middle of the day because he's resting. The disciples have gone into the town to get something to eat. He's there, and this woman comes out, and it's just him and her. And the reason she's there is because she's been ostracized from society. That's where we're going to pick this story up. So follow along with me as we read verses 16 through 18. Go and get your husband, Jesus told her. I don't have a husband, the woman replied. Jesus said, you're right. Now notice how I said that, judgmental, right? No, I don't think Jesus said that. He said, you're right. You don't have a husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and you aren't even married to the man you're living with now. You certainly spoke the truth. Jesus had a word of knowledge. He had a knowledge of something that he had no way of knowing the natural. Of course, he was walking as the second Adam. The Holy Spirit was in him. So he experienced this manifestation gift of the word of knowledge. He knew that this woman had been married 5 times, and the woman she was living with now was not her husband. Wow. She'd been married 5 times. She'd been married so many times, she'd finally given up on marriage. So instead, she was now living with a man, which in their culture was just unheard of. So let me ask you a question. Was this woman just unlucky in love? No. One of 2 things was happening. She was either choosing the wrong type of men to marry because she'd been divorced not just once, not just twice, but people 5 times. That's a pattern. Or she was doing something that was destroying her marriages. In other words, she had a pattern of behavior that was self-destructive. But either way, there's a pattern here. Whatever she was doing it over and over again. So when it came to a relationship with men, this woman was really screwed up. But I can guarantee you, if you trace the problem back to the root cause, what you'd find is a wrong perception. She either had a wrong perception of men, so she kept marrying the wrong type of men, or she had the wrong perception of proper behavior, so she kept making the same mistakes over and over again. But it all boils down to this. She had the wrong perception in one of those 2 areas. Now, let's go back to marriage. As I said when we started this sermon, the more screwed up you are, the more screwed up your marriage will be. The less screwed up your marriage will be. And again, notice that I use the word more and less, insinuating that everyone is screwed up to some degree. Because we all have the Adamic nature within us, which means that we're not perfect. We're sinful creatures. And our parents were sinful creatures, and their parents were sinful creatures. So as a result of that, every one of us is screwed up to some degree. Some are just more screwed up than others. But that's why everyone has problems in their marriage from time to time. It's because everyone is screwed up to some degree. The problem is we usually don't know that we're screwed up. In other words, we don't realize that we're dysfunctional and that we were raised in a dysfunctional family because we don't know any different. From our perspective, what we've experienced growing up was normal. Now, everyone knows what I mean by dysfunctional, right? Dysfunctional means that the way you function or the way that your family functions is abnormal. You see, the prefix dys, D-Y-S, literally means abnormal. And when you add it to the root word function, it means to function in an abnormal way. So if you have a dysfunctional family, it means that your family does not function in a normal way. Some of you probably think that screaming, cussing, and slamming doors is normal because that's what you grew up with. So let me just tell you, that's not normal. That's abnormal. And if you're doing that, you have a dysfunctional family. You were probably raised in a dysfunctional family. In fact, you're dysfunctional. Now, when you take two people who grew up in a dysfunctional family and you join them in marriage, guess what you get? You get a dysfunctional marriage. A marriage that doesn't function normally. And that's why I say the more screwed up you are, the more screwed up your marriage will be. The less screwed up you are, the less screwed up your marriage will be. That's also why God doesn't fix marriages. Let me say that again. The first time I ever said that, you could have seen everyone's jaw just drop. Because one time I was teaching on marriage and I said, God doesn't fix marriages. And people were like, oh, God does too fix marriages. No, God doesn't. God does not fix marriages. You might be here and you might be saying, but Pastor, I've been praying for 20 years for God to fix my marriage. I've got bad news for you. God does not fix marriages. God fixes people. Your marriage isn't broke. You are. Listen to me. The marriage covenant is an intangible thing. That means you can't touch it. It's not physical. If you came to me and you said, Pastor Allen, my marriage is broke, I wouldn't tell you, get behind me. You two get behind me. Let me look at your marriage. And I pull out this box and I start trying to fix it. No, people, the marriage covenant is perfect. God designed the marriage covenant. It is perfect. The problem is the people in the marriage covenant. So God doesn't fix marriages, God fixes people. Before Adam and Eve sinned, they entered into a marriage covenant and they had the perfect marriage. But then they sinned. And all of a sudden, things change. Now Adam's blaming everyone but himself. God, it's the woman that you gave me that caused me to eat of that. It wasn't just the woman's fault. It was now God's fault for giving him the woman. So all of a sudden, there's a problem in the marriage because from that very moment, Eve is upset because Adam betrayed her. He blamed it on me. So now you had your first fight. But I want you to understand, there was nothing wrong with the marriage. Marriage is intangible. It's the people in the marriage. So when I tell you that God doesn't fix marriages, what I'm telling you is the marriage isn't broke, you're broke. And for your marriage to be fixed, you have to be fixed. So what do we do, Pastor Allen? Well, the first thing you need to do is consider the possibility that what you think is right is really wrong. In other words, you need to consider the possibility that you might have the wrong perspective on a lot of things. Secondly, you need to consider the possibility that you might have grown up in a dysfunctional home. So what you consider to be normal might be abnormal. Listen to me. If you give your spouse the silent treatment for long periods of time, that's not normal. If you yell, scream, or break things, that's not normal. If you slam doors and you cuss like a sailor, that's not normal. If you try to manipulate or control your spouse, that's not normal. If you try to isolate your spouse from their family and their friends, that's not normal. If you keep secrets from your spouse, that's not normal. If you use sex, ladies, as leverage to get what you want, that's not normal. All of the things that I just mentioned and more would qualify as dysfunctional behavior. In other words, you're functioning in a way that is abnormal. It's not normal. The third thing that you need to do is draw a genogram of your family. Does everyone know what a genogram is? A genogram is kind of like a family tree, except it's meant to reveal dysfunctional behavior within a family that's passed on from generation to generation. What it does is it helps you to visualize the generational sin that's been passed down from previous generations in your family. So hopefully you can stop it and keep from passing it on to your family. How many of you work in the medical field? You use genograms and you might not know it. Maybe you do know it. What is a genogram in the medical field? A genogram is trying to find your medical history. If your grandmother had colon cancer like my grandmother did, and several of your aunts had colon cancer, and several of your cousins had colon cancer, that means that at 40 I had to have a colonoscopy. And where everyone else, if they don't have polyps, gets to wait 7 years before they have another one, if you have a family history of it, you do it every 3 to 4 years. Crap. Because that's what's coming out when you prep for a colonoscopy. The first time I had to have a colonoscopy, I thought I could go to work and still work while I was prepping. I found out I couldn't. I thought, oh dear Lord, help me get home. I didn't have leather seats. I'm here to tell you, in the medical field, what you're looking for is a medical history of your family. Is there a history of diabetes in your family? Is there a history of lung cancer or colon cancer or some other type? Is there a history of any disease or sickness? That's a genogram. Now, they might not draw out the family tree, but that's what a genogram is. Psychologists use genograms, but they actually draw it out. They have their patients, and if you're a counselor and you don't use this, boy, you need to. It will open up your eyes. It's one of the quickest tools that you can use to see what type of dysfunctional behavior that's within the people that you're trying to treat or whatever. But anyways, what you do is you draw out this family tree. All right? And you go back to your grandparents, or if your grandparents are still alive, maybe even the grandparents, and then you describe your grandparents' relationship with each other and with their kids, which is your parents and your uncles and aunts. So basically, you're asking, what was their relationship like? How did they resolve conflict? How did they express anger? How did they discipline? How did they express affection? Did they have any addictions, etc.? And you do the same thing with your parents and your uncles and your aunts, and then for yourself, and then you look for patterns. Because dysfunctional behavior is usually passed down from generation to generation. The same type of dysfunctional behavior. And you'll see a pattern to it. You see, if you're raised in a dysfunctional home, you don't know that it's dysfunctional. Because to you, that's all you've ever known. That's normal to you. And that's why we pass that on from generation to generation. So what you're trying to do in a genogram is you're trying to go back and ask certain questions about your grandparents and about your parents and uncles and aunts and about yourself. You're trying to find a pattern to it. Now, let me show you a genogram of King David's family and a genogram of Jacob's family so you can see how this works. Here's a genogram of King David's family. Notice this. This is a family tree. So what you would do is you would draw out a family tree. Grandpa's up here if you want to go all the way back to your great-grandparents, but this is Grandpa. This is my parents and my uncles and aunts. And then here's the children. And you draw that out. Now, when you look at this genogram, you can't help but see a pattern of sexual sin. As you can see, David had multiple wives, which violated one of God's commandments in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17. God never approved of polygamy. Why isn't it in the Bible then, Pastor Allen? Because God is giving progressive revelation. But from the very beginning, the two were to become one. It was to be Adam and Eve and no more. But because of sin entering in and because wanting more male offspring, then you begin to see this taking place. But God didn't come in and automatically have this Bible, and so he comes to Abraham and says, okay, this is the Bible and it's going to be future. No, this revelation is progressive. But I want you to understand, even in the Old Testament, we see scriptures that says polygamy is wrong. And in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse number 17, David was not supposed to have multiple wives. David also committed adultery with Bathsheba, and then he tried to hide it. The way he tried to hide it was he tried to have Uriah come home, sleep with his wife, so he would think the child is his, and when he wouldn't do that, he had Uriah murdered. Oh, this is the man after God's own heart. You think you're perfect? Let's look at your heart. His oldest son, Amnon, raped his half-sister Tamar and disgraced her. Absalom, another son, slept with all of David's concubines. And Solomon, whom David chose to inherit the throne after him, had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now listen to me. If he slept with one of his wives, not even getting to his concubines, he could barely sleep with all of them in a period of 2 years. By the time you had your concubines, he couldn't sleep with all of them if he had sex once a night with a different person in 2 years. That's messed up. Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son and who inherited the throne, had 18 wives and 60 concubines. So you can clearly see a pattern of sexual sin. And it goes from generation to generation. Now, what you would do in your family tree is you need a lot of space to the side of this family tree because you're going to draw a box and you're going to write all this information in on each person. You also can see, when you look at David's genogram, a pattern of family division and sibling rivalry. David had tensions with his brothers, and he passed that down to his children. One of his sons, Absalom, murdered his brother Amnon. Absalom also tried to overthrow David to take the throne. Solomon killed his brother Adonijah in a struggle over the throne, and it goes on and on and on. Just read about the mess his kids were in. Now, if your family's genogram looks like this, I guarantee you, you're dysfunctional. And you were raised in a dysfunctional family, but you don't know it. Because it's normal to you. It's normal that your grandparents were divorced and remarried. It's normal that your parents are divorced and remarried, and all your uncles and aunts, and now you're on your third. That's normal to you. That's what happens in families, or so you think. Now, people from the outside looking in look at your family and go, woo. And if they ever bring it up, you go, what? No one can talk about your family but you. But you see, you put walls up, and to you, they're normal. It's your family. Now, let's look at Jacob's family, because you want to see a screwed up family. Let's go back to Jacob. Now, let me just say this, because you need to understand this. Well, I'm not sure I want to do a genogram. God did. You know, it's kind of interesting when you draw all this out and you look at it, you're going to want to lock it up. You don't want people to see it. It's skeletons in the closet, right? So go buy you a lock box, put a little lock on it. You don't even want your kids to see it till they get older, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But here's what's kind of interesting. You know what God does? He takes all of these things that we would consider to be dirty laundry, and he airs them out for us to see. For us to see how dysfunctional behavior is passed from generation to generation in order to help us to see that we have dysfunctional behavior in our family and it's passed from generation to generation. So let's look at Jacob's family. If you think that David's family was messed up, whew! Abraham, that mighty man of God, I told you, remember, that everyone is screwed up to some degree, right? Abraham was a man after God. He was God's man. God called him friend. But let me tell you, Abraham was screwed up too. When you look at this genogram, you can't help but see a pattern of lying and trickery and deception. I use the word trickery because I've been watching football, and about 4 or 5 years ago, they coined a word called trickeration. How many of you like football? You know, that was the new word about 4 or 5 years ago. Notice the trickeration. Oh my gosh. But anyways, you'll see this. First of all, Abraham lied not once but twice about Sarah, saying she was his sister, not his wife. Rebekah and Isaac's marriage was dominated by lies and deception and trickery. Just read Genesis chapter 27. Just read that one chapter. It's like, oh my gosh. Jacob, my gosh, he took it to a whole nother level. We could spend a whole hour talking about the things that Jacob did, but let me just explain what he did and how it affected his family. By the 4th generation, 10 of Jacob's sons faked their brother's death. Joseph, they sold him into slavery, if you remember, but they faked his death. And they went through all the motions of a wake, funeral, and time of mourning just to maintain the lie. If you remember, they took off his coat of many colors, and they ripped it up, and then they killed a sheep, and they took the blood, and they put it on there, and they took it back to their father. They said, "We don't know what happened to Joseph, but we found his coat." And his dad said, "That's Joseph's coat." And it broke his heart, and he mourned. And the brothers, they went through the whole schmeal. They went through the wake. They went through the funeral just to maintain the lie. A second pattern you see is where one parent in each generation had a favorite child. Abraham's favorite child was Isaac. Isaac's was Esau. Rebekah's was Jacob. Jacob's was Joseph, and later Benjamin, because he thought Joseph was dead. And this created a tremendous amount of sibling rivalry. I mean, you just look at how the brothers treated each other. And really it lines up according to, because again, here's the sin of having, I'm going to call them concubines, but the Bible says handmaidens. So he has polygamy. He's married to Rachel and Leah, but of course they give their handmaidens to him. But here's what's kind of interesting. You'll notice how the brothers group up according to the mothers. Yeah. Now, if your family genogram looks like this, I promise you, you're screwed up. You're dysfunctional. And your family is dysfunctional, but you don't know that. In fact, this morning might be the first time that you've ever entertained the thought that, oh my gosh, my family, they're nuts. Yeah. But you see, if you don't realize that, what you do, you think is normal. Let me just tell you a little bit. I'll share more after my dad passes away. I'm not going to share on my family. My family's still living. Lisa doesn't have that blessing. Bless her heart, her parents are dead. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about her family. Kui was raised in a home where he was never told that he was loved. He was shown that he was loved. But his parents never actually physically told him, Kui, we love you. So Kui never told his children they loved her. My wife grew up, and when she married me, her dad had never, ever told her that he loved her. He showed her he loved her, but he never said it. And when I found that out, I couldn't believe it, because we grew up like the Waltons. When we went to bed at night, it was, good night, Riddell, I love you. Good night, Doug, I love you. Good night, Carol, I love you. I mean, we went through that whole thing. How many of you remember the Waltons? If you're young, you don't even know. But anyways, my grandmother's favorite show, because it kind of reminded her how she grew up. But anyways, so when I found out that Kui had never told my wife that he loved her, I was just blown away. So one day after we were married, I went in the jewelry store where Lisa was working and talking with her, and I was getting ready to go back to work. And so I said, honey, I love you. And the Holy Spirit just checked me and said, tell Kui you love him. So I looked over there, and Kui was at his watch bench. He was working on his watches. He had his glasses and that little magnifying glass that was connected to his glasses. He was working. I said, Kui, I love you. I'll never forget this. Kui looked up. He had to do this because the glasses were such on the end of his nose that he wanted to look where without seeing me. And he just stared at me. He didn't say anything. Awkward. So I just left. Thanks God for making me look like an idiot. 2 weeks later, I'm in there. I get ready to leave. I say, honey, I love you. And God says, tell Kui you love him. I said, Lord, you know how that turned out last time. I said, tell him. I said, Kui, I love you. You looked up. Well, Maydeen and I love you both. That's the best he could do. 2 weeks goes by. I do the same thing. And he says it real soft. He says, I love you too. And goes right back to working. From that moment on, he began telling his children. He would tell Lisa, Lisa, I love you. He would tell his other kids, I love you. Now you see, some of you might have grown up in a home where your parents never expressed love vocally. They never said they love you. And you don't tell your kids you love them. And well, you know, we just don't express love that way. You know, it's just kind of hard. That's because you're dysfunctional. It's not normal to express how you feel. You do it when you hit your thumb with a hammer, don't you? When you get mad, you express how you feel, don't you? It's not normal to not express that. Those are the things you are looking for when you do your genogram. You're looking for, as I said, how did they interact with each other? How did they express love? When they got angry, how did they act? And so you're asking all of these type of questions and you're writing it down, and what you're looking for is a pattern. And this pattern explains why you do what you do and why you think it's normal. Now, I encourage you to do a genogram of your family, and once you discover your family's pattern of dysfunctional behavior, you can give it to God. And you can allow Him to start working in that area of your life, because your goal is to become emotionally healthy so you can have a better marriage, because the less screwed up you are, the less screwed up your marriage will be. But more importantly, you won't pass that dysfunctional behavior on to your children. Now, for us to change, we have to be totally honest with ourselves. You see, when we're honest with ourselves and we're objective, that allows God to minister in the areas of our life that need it the most. But when we're in denial, people, that can't happen. Instead, we restrict God from ministering in those areas. In essence, those areas of our life are off limits. We don't go there, and neither can God. And when God tries to go there, we go, no, God, we don't go there. And we refuse to talk about anything that has to do with those areas. Listen to me. We have to give God access to the areas of our life that have previously been off limits to Him, because those are the areas that are causing problems in your life. Those are the areas where there is a pattern of dysfunctional behavior. And it's that pattern of dysfunctional behavior that's given you a crappy life. Let me just be honest with you. We're promised 70 years. And if by strength you live to be 80. And today we can live to be 90 if you take care of ourselves because of medicine. But I'll be honest with you. That's a short period of time. I've said this before. My grandmother, Granny Riddell, she died at the age of 76 of colon cancer. Came to live with us for the last 2 years. Saw her become a human skeleton. Saw her when she died. I'm not going to go there. Let me move on. Some of you have had some traumatic things happen in your past. Maybe you were molested. Maybe you were bullied. I don't know. Let me say this. If that happened to you, you need to go to counseling. You need to get you a journal. And you need to write down, and you need to write it in a way in which you're telling God, God, this is what happened to me. And you write it down in detail. And then you write down how it affected you. God, this is how it affected me. And by doing that, what you're doing is you're giving God access to the areas of your life that have previously been off limits to Him. Simply because you refuse to go there. And because you refuse to go there, then God couldn't go there. And when you give God access to those areas, He'll start speaking to you when you read the Bible and when you come to church. He'll show you verses you've never seen before, and He'll start talking to you, bringing healing and restoration to your life. And then let me tell you what you need to do when your children grow up and get married. When your children grow up and get married, you need to pull that out of the lockbox. You need to pull out your family genogram. You need to pull out your journal. And you need to ask your kids to come. Not their spouses, just your children. And you need to say, I've never told you this, but this is what happened to me when I was 10 years old or when I was 12 years old. And this is how it affected me. Because your kids need to know why you behaved the way you behaved. But they also need to know how it affected them. And you can begin to share what God's doing in your life. People, let me just tell you something. Life is short. As I said, 70 if by strength you get 80. I'm 57 years old now. At 57, I realize in 13 years I'll be 70. In 23 years, I'll be 80. I'm no longer like this. I'm going like this. But it's okay. But the more I'm going like this with each passing year, the more I realize I don't have much time on this earth. Why spend my time on this earth with all of this hurt? With all of this abnormality? With all of these problems? Why not be honest and allow God to deal with it? And then when you are honest with your children for the first time, they begin to look at this and they go, whoa. Mom, I'm so sorry. Or Dad, I'm so sorry. I never knew that happened to you. In fact, I never even realized that affected the way you raised us. I just thought that was normal. And I see that this is how I'm raising my kids, not knowing that it can all be traced back to a certain traumatic event. How many of you like Joyce Meyer? I can share this about Joyce because Joyce shares it. When Joyce reached her teenage years, her dad raped her. And from what I understand in the story, he raped her at least once a week. And if you've ever been molested, this is what she says. Beth Moore says the same thing. She says, whenever you walk into a room, even if no one has any clue that you've ever been molested, you think everyone can see it. It's like you got this big M on you, molested. Or A, abnormal. And as a result of that, it affects the way you see yourself. It affects the way you see others. It affects everything about you. Again, that's perception. And Jesus told us if the eye is bad, if our perception is bad, then the light we think we have, the truth we think we have is really darkness, which is falsehood. In other words, what we think is true is really false. And so what's interesting is Joyce Meyer had all of this dysfunctional behavior within her. She'd been raised in this. Now, she knew that wasn't normal, but she didn't realize that the way she acted was abnormal, and she marries a healthy person. But now you've got a person that's dysfunctional marrying someone who's emotionally healthy, but you still get what? A dysfunctional marriage. But because of Dave, and probably counseling that she doesn't talk about, she dealt with those issues. And God started doing a healing within her. And she began to see that the way she perceived things was wrong. What she thought was right was really wrong, and things began to change within her. And now, she ministers to thousands of women and also men because she's healthy. In fact, she blows my mind. When her dad got to a certain age and he couldn't take care of herself, she forgave her dad, and she's actually taking care of him. I don't know if he's passed away now. But I'm thinking, man, that's love. But it also shows what God can do in a heart. If you've got a bad marriage, the problem is not your marriage. The problem is you. We have to deal with this because next week we're going to look at certain things that if you're not honest, you're not going to be able to move on with me as we teach on marriage.